1204 was a bad year for King John. First of all, it saw the end of one of the most remarkable lives of any medieval woman. Eleanor of Aquitaine, wife to 2 kings and mother of another 2, including John, had died aged 80. For both her husbands, she had proved too hot to handle. Firstly, for Louis VII of France. Louis was too dull for Eleanor, and she was also not impressed by his terrible leadership during the Second Crusade, of which they had both been a part of, and which had proved to be a total disaster for the Christian West. Eleanor then initiated their divorce before she married the future Henry II of England, shortly before he became king. Their marriage started well. They produced 4 male heirs, including John, who was the youngest. But the relationship between Henry and Eleanor declined as Henry began to keep mistresses, much to Eleanor's disgust. In revenge, she might well have had one of her rivals murdered, and then she initiated her frustrated sons to go into open rebellion against their father. She paid the price for this, and she was imprisoned between 1174 until the death of Henry II in 1189. She was released upon the succession of her favourite son, Richard I. So she now went from rebel to regent, and she played a crucial role in the governance of England, as Richard spent most of his decade-long reign outside of the country. When Richard died during a siege in 1199, Eleanor then backed the claims of her youngest son, John, over those of her grandson, Arthur, who had the more legitimate claim. John had much to be grateful for to his mother, and in 1203 he repaid her a bit of the debt that he owed her when he rescued her from Arthur's forces. During that particular rescue mission, he also managed to capture his rival to the crown, his nephew, Arthur. Eleanor, by this point, was now a very aged woman by the Middle Ages standards. She was pushing 80. So she took the veil as a nun and retired to a convent, knowing that she had little time left. Her death the following year wouldn't have been a surprise to John, but it would have taken from him a figure of reassurance and comfort. His reign was now descending into chaos, and the French king had him very much on the back foot, so Eleanor's passing would have been a blow. Around the time of his mother's passing, John had been in negotiations with Philip II of France to secure a peace treaty. To do so, John had sent an impressive group of people, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, as well as the finest knight of the day, William Marshal, to try and secure the peace, at least on a temporary basis. But Philip knew he held all the cards. John had shot himself in the foot a couple of years earlier by attacking the Count of La Marche after promising Philip that he would not attack any of Philip's nobility. And this was the excuse Philip needed to attack the Angevin Empire. He had made significant gains before he suffered a slight setback when Arthur, who had been under his control, had been recaptured by his uncle John. Philip pulled back, but he remained confident that John's French possessions would soon fall into his grasp. From the peace talks, he demanded that Arthur be released, otherwise there'd be no deal. But by the time of these peace talks, Arthur had disappeared. The circumstances are mysterious, but it seems almost certain that John had had his nephew killed. Some even speculate that Arthur's death had been caused by John himself, A story goes that one night John had become so intoxicated that he killed Arthur and tied a stone to his corpse and then threw the dead body into the River Seine. Whether this is true or not is hard to say, but John is certainly the reason that Arthur was dead. Rumours would have reached Philip about Arthur's fate, but he wouldn't have been sure if Arthur was still alive. But dead or alive, Philip could use the situation to his advantage, and he continued to demand Arthur's release. The situation in France was now dire for John. Philip took Falaise, the birthplace of William the Conqueror, and then Caen, before he captured Barfleur and Cherbourg. John was helpless as the rest of Normandy soon fell to the French king. After Normandy, Anjou, Brittany, Maine, and Tours also fell. An unmitigated disaster was unfolding before John's eyes, and he was totally powerless to stop it. The ease with which the English possessions in France had fallen was almost shocking. 1204 had been a calamitous year for John. In 1205, John decided that he was going to try and remedy the previous year, and he decided to invade France. He had done so at the encouragement of some of the Norman nobility, who were not at all happy with the treatment that they were receiving from Philip. The decision taken by John to reclaim his French possessions was not without its strong critics. One of those at the forefront of the counter-arguments was William Marshal. Several different arguments against the invasion were put forward, including that greater disaster could befall John, for instance, his own death. He could also be, and probably would be, totally outnumbered by the French king, and even that he was leaving England open to a possible invasion, and John could even lose his crown. I also think it's quite likely that Marshal seriously doubted John's military capabilities. If that was the case, then Marshal was quite right to do so. Marshal's arguments eventually won the day, and John abandoned his plan to go to France. However, this caused a great deal of disgust amongst his men, who were furious that the efforts that they had made to prepare for the invasion were in vain, and to make things worse, John had ordered them to repay the money he had given them for their troubles. This failed expedition would have left a lot of men out of pocket, and John's nobility absolutely disgusted with the English king. Shortly after this fiasco, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Hubert Walter, died. This now led to John falling out with the Church, and more seriously, the Pope. Pope Innocent III had given his consent for Stephen Langton to be made the new Archbishop of Canterbury, but John refused to acknowledge this appointment, and when Stephen headed for England from Rome, John refused to let him in the country. John was demonstrating his total lack of wisdom. To boot, he then kicked the monks out of Canterbury Cathedral for supporting Stephen's appointment. Whilst the row with the papacy rumbled on, some better news did arrive for John, and that was the birth of a son and heir in 1207. This baby was to become king, aged 9, in 1216, as Henry III. But the situation with the Church was rapidly getting worse, and because of John's headstronginess, the bishops of London, Chester, Ely, and Hereford, as well as the Archbishop of York, left the country disgusted by John's handling of the vacant archbishopric at Canterbury. John is accused of harassing the Church, stealing their lands and property, which increasingly infuriated the Pope in Rome. Attempts were made to heal the rift between John and Innocent, but in 1208 John was excommunicated. Church services across England were suspended, and in a time where people had strong religious beliefs, this would have caused a great deal of distress and done absolutely nothing for John's popularity. The excommunication went as far as preventing burials in churches, leaving those who had died to be buried in rather abject places. The excommunication failed to have any impact on John, and he continued to persecute members of the clergy, forcing some to flee. Even those higher up in the church suffered. Cardinals, who received rent from lands they held, had this seized from them. And it wasn't just the church who suffered under John, it was the entire English populace. Heavy and burdensome taxes were placed, financially crippling many. John is even accused of imprisoning his own queen, Isabella. What is the cause of this tyranny that John had now descended into? I would believe it has something very much to do with frustration and a feeling of inadequacy. He had been thoroughly defeated by Philip II in France, but he still harboured hopes of reclaiming and re-establishing the Angevin Empire, and would indeed make further attempts to do so. The greed that now consumed him was in preparation for another war. The more he could enrich himself, the more a glorious invasion he could hope to launch. Or that was the theory, anyway. But in 1210, John hit a new low by persecuting the Jewish community this time. He blinded some, hanged others, and stole their lands and property, further enriching himself. We are now at the end of the middle period of John's reign, and it's clear to see that John was very much on the path to be one of England's worst ever kings, and things were to get even worse still. He had failed dismally in France. He had made an enemy of the Pope, who was in almost constant communication with the English king, ordering him to refrain from his destructive measures against the church and English people, and he had absolutely no moderation in anything he did. John was now on the road to Magna Carta.